It was a quiet night in the small, sleepy town of Maple Ridge, nestled against the edge of a vast, dense forest. The kind of night where the only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. John, a solitary man in his early 30s, sat on the porch of his old wooden cabin, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring into the darkness. His life was simple, almost boring. Early mornings chopping wood, afternoons fixing things around the house, and evenings lost in old books. Nothing extraordinary ever happened in Maple Ridge. At least, that's what he thought. But then the sky split open. A blinding streak of light tore through the heavens, casting eerie shadows across the forest. The ground trembled under John's feet as a deafening boom echoed through the night, shaking the very air around him. His coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering against the porch floor, but he didn't even flinch. His eyes were locked on the horizon, where the light had disappeared behind the trees. The forest, usually a place of calm and quiet, now pulsed with an unnatural energy. John grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, a habit more than a necessity, and headed towards the source of the disturbance. The path through the woods was familiar, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavy, charged with something he couldn't explain. As he pushed deeper into the forest, the smell of burning metal and scorched earth grew stronger, making his heart pound harder in his chest. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he reached a small clearing. What he saw made him freeze in his tracks. There, in the middle of the clearing, lay the twisted remains of something that clearly wasn't from Earth. The object was massive, half buried in the dirt, its surface glowing faintly with strange, pulsing symbols. Smoke hissed from ruptured seams, and sparks danced across the shattered metal like fireflies. It wasn't just a crash, it was a catastrophe. But it wasn't the wreckage that made John's breath catch in his throat. It was what lay beside it. A figure, crumpled on the ground, barely visible through the smoke and debris. At first glance, it looked human. A woman, perhaps. But as John cautiously approached, he realized there was something off. Her skin had a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, like moonlight reflecting off water. Her hair, long and silver, seemed to float slightly even though there was no wind. And her eyes, when they fluttered open for just a brief second, were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Deep, luminous, and filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across galaxies. John's first instinct was to run. Whatever this was, it wasn't his problem. But something in those eyes stopped him. A plea, silent yet desperate, echoed louder than any words could. Against every ounce of logic screaming in his head, John knelt beside her. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. Without thinking, he gently lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body almost weightless, as if she were made of something other than flesh and bone. As he carried her back through the forest, the reality of what he'd just done began to sink in. He had found something, or someone, not of this world. And now she was his responsibility. But John had no idea that this night, which had started like any other, was about to change his life forever. Because somewhere in the shadows of the trees, unseen eyes were watching. And they weren't human. John's cabin stood at the edge of the forest, its wooden walls weathered by years of rain and wind, yet sturdy enough to offer a sense of safety. But as he pushed open the creaking door with the strange woman in his arms, that feeling of safety felt like a fragile illusion. The warmth of the cabin's dim light cast flickering shadows across the room, but it did little to ease the tension knotting in his chest. He laid her gently on the old, worn-out couch, her shimmering skin contrasting sharply against the rough fabric. She looked peaceful now, but her breaths were shallow, her face pale in a way that wasn't quite human. John didn't know what to do. He wasn't a doctor. Hell, he barely knew how to treat a common cold, let alone whatever this was. Still, he couldn't just sit there and watch her fade away. He grabbed a damp cloth from the kitchen, wiping the dirt and blood. If that's what the faint silver liquid was, from her face. Her skin felt cool to the touch, not cold, but not warm either, like touching metal left out on a cloudy day. Hours passed, and John sat nearby, his eyes flicking from the woman to the window, half expecting someone, or something, to come crashing through the trees after her. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Whatever had happened out there, it wasn't over. Suddenly, she stirred. It was a small movement at first, a twitch of her fingers, a faint, sharp intake of breath. John leaned forward, heart pounding. Her eyes snapped open, glowing faintly in the dim light, and in that instant, the room seemed to shrink. Those eyes, deep and luminous like pools of liquid starlight, locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with an unspoken tension. Then she recoiled, her body jerking violently as she tried to push herself away. Her lips moved, but the sounds that came out weren't words. At least, not any John had ever heard. A series of sharp, melodic tones filled the room, like a language from a dream. Her fear was palpable, her wide eyes darting around, taking in her unfamiliar surroundings with growing panic. Hey, it's okay, John said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. His voice was low, calm, though his heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of his chest. You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you. But she didn't understand. Or maybe she didn't believe him. Her breathing quickened, her body tense like a cornered animal. Then, as if realizing she couldn't escape, her expression shifted from fear to something more heartbreaking. Resignation. She slumped back against the couch, her glowing eyes dulling as she stared at the ceiling. John didn't know what to say. What could he say? He had just pulled an alien, an actual alien, out of a crashed spaceship and brought her into his home. But despite her otherworldly appearance, there was something deeply human in the way she looked at him now. Pain, fear, loss. These weren't the emotions of some distant, cold species. They were emotions John recognized all too well. Hours crept by in uneasy silence. She didn't speak, didn't move much, just lay there with a distant look in her eyes. But then, as dawn began to creep through the curtains, she finally spoke again. This time, the sounds were different, slower, more deliberate. She seemed to be struggling, searching for the right way to communicate. Her glowing eyes flicked to John. And then, in a voice that was soft, melodic, and slightly distorted, she whispered a single word. Zyra. John blinked, processing what he'd just heard. Zyra. He repeated, pointing gently at her. Is that your name? She gave the faintest nod, her expression still guarded but less hostile now. It was progress, however small. I'm John, he said, placing a hand on his chest. John. Zyra's lips moved, forming the word awkwardly, her accent strange and lilting. June. For a moment, a fragile connection formed between them, a bridge across the vast distance that separated their worlds. But it was fleeting. Zyra's gaze shifted to the window, her eyes narrowing with sudden tension. John followed her line of sight, but all he could see was the thick forest outside, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. But Zyra saw something else, something John couldn't. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. They are coming. John's blood ran cold. Whoever they were, Zyra wasn't just scared of them. She was terrified. And now, so was he. The weight of Zyra's words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. They are coming. The fear in her eyes wasn't just the fear of someone who'd been hurt. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what was chasing her. And now, by helping her, John had unknowingly painted a target on his own back. The morning light streaming through the windows felt colder than usual, as if the very world outside had shifted. John moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass into the dense forest beyond. Everything looked normal. The tall pines swayed gently in the breeze. Birds chirped as they always did at dawn, but the tranquility felt like a fragile mask, hiding something far more sinister underneath. Turning back to Zira, John saw that her breathing had become erratic again. She was sitting up now, her hands clutching the edge of the couch, her glowing eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. It was clear she wasn't used to feeling trapped. Whatever planet she was from, John guessed she wasn't someone who ran from danger lightly. "You need to tell me what's going on," John said, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "Who's coming?" Zira struggled with the words, her alien tongue tripping over human sounds. But after a few seconds, she managed to form a sentence, though her accent was thick and the words felt foreign in her mouth. "My people, they betrayed me," she whispered, each word seeming to cost her effort. "They hunt now." John's mind raced. Her people? Aliens? Here, on Earth. It sounded like something out of a bad sci-fi movie, but the raw terror in her voice was all too real. He didn't know what kind of beings Zira's people were, but if they had technology advanced enough to reach Earth, and to do this to their own, then they were more dangerous than he could imagine. "How long do we have?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Zira's eyes flicked towards the sky, as if she could sense something beyond what human eyes could see. "Soon," she murmured. "Very soon." A cold chill slid down John's spine. He needed to think fast. His cabin was secluded, hidden in the woods, but if these aliens had the technology to travel across galaxies, finding one human home in the middle of the forest wouldn't be much of a challenge. Staying here was suicide. John grabbed a backpack from the closet, stuffing it with essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, and the small collection of tools he kept around for emergencies. He didn't have a plan yet, but one thing was clear: they couldn't stay here. "You can walk, right?" he asked, turning back to Zira. She hesitated, then nodded weakly. Her movements were stiff, but she managed to stand, her shimmering skin catching the light as she did. Despite her fragile appearance, there was a strength in her posture, a determination that told John she wasn't ready to give up just yet. As they stepped outside, the forest greeted them with an eerie silence. The usual sounds of wildlife had faded, replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed against John's ears like cotton. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They moved quickly, sticking to the dense undergrowth to stay hidden from view. John led the way, his shotgun clutched tightly in his hands, though he doubted it would be much use against whatever was coming. Zira followed close behind, her glowing eyes constantly scanning the trees, as if expecting danger to leap out at any moment. They had barely made it a mile into the forest when Zira suddenly froze. Her body went rigid, and her hand shot out, grabbing John's arm with surprising strength. He opened his mouth to ask what was wrong, but she silenced him with a sharp glance. Then he heard it, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't like any sound John had ever heard, mechanical, but alive, as if the forest itself was resonating with some alien frequency. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would give them away. Zira pulled him down behind a fallen log just as the source of the sound came into view. Hovering silently above the trees was a sleek, black craft, its surface smooth and reflective like liquid metal. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding through the air as if gravity had no hold over it. Strange symbols pulsed along its sides, glowing faintly in the dim light. But it wasn't the ship that sent a jolt of fear through John's chest. It was what followed. Figures, tall and thin, emerged from the shadows beneath the ship. Their skin was a dull gray, their eyes black voids that reflected no light. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace, their heads swiveling as they scanned the forest with devices that emitted sharp beams of light. They were hunting. John held his breath, praying they wouldn't be discovered. Zira's grip on his arm tightened, her body trembling slightly. He could feel the tension radiating off her, the fear that went deeper than mere survival. These weren't just enemies. These were monsters from her past, and now they were here, on Earth. The aliens moved closer, their lights sweeping across the forest floor. John could see the details of their faces now. Smooth, expressionless, like masks carved from stone. They didn't look human. They didn't feel human, and something deep inside John told him they wouldn't hesitate to kill. Just when John thought they were about to be discovered, one of the aliens stopped, tilting its head as if listening to something unheard. Then, without warning, the group turned and moved deeper into the forest, their lights fading into the distance. John let out a shaky breath, his heart still racing. But the relief was short-lived. Zira turned to him, her eyes filled with a new kind of fear. "They will not stop," she whispered. "They never stop." John knew then that this was only the beginning. The hunt had started, and it wouldn't end until one of them was dead. The forest felt tighter now, as if the very trees were closing in on them. The faint hum of the alien craft had faded into the distance, but its echoes still vibrated in John's bones. Zira moved beside him, her steps light but hurried, her glowing eyes constantly scanning the shadows. She was no longer just a stranger in need of help. She was a hunted being. And now, by extension, so was John. They paused by a narrow stream, the water trickling quietly over smooth stones. John crouched down, splashing some on his face, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. The cold shock did little to ease his nerves. He glanced at Zira, who stood rigid, her eyes distant. She wasn't just afraid. She was calculating, trying to think ahead. John could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers flexed, like she was readying herself for something. "We can't keep running like this," John finally said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice felt too loud against the quiet backdrop of the forest. "They'll find us sooner or later. We need a plan." Zira turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, John wondered if she even understood what he was saying, but then she nodded slowly. "They track everything," she said, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "Sound, heat, life." John's heart sank. Everything. That meant hiding wouldn't be enough. They needed to outthink them, stay a step ahead. But how do you outsmart something that's not even from your world? Zira knelt by the stream, her hand dipping into the water. When she pulled it out, her skin shimmered more brightly, the faint glow illuminating the strange, almost circuit-like patterns that ran along her veins. John had noticed them before, but now he saw them differently. They weren't just part of her biology. They were something more, something technological. "You have tech," John said, realization dawning on him. "Something that can help us." Zira hesitated, then reached into the folds of her strange, metallic-looking garment. From a hidden pocket, she pulled out a small device, no larger than a deck of cards. It pulsed with the same faint light as her skin, its surface covered in symbols John couldn't begin to understand. "This cloaks us," she whispered. "But broken." John's mind raced. A cloaking device, like something out of a science fiction movie. But it was damaged. Still, if there was even a chance it could work, it was better than nothing. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Zira shook her head slowly. "Need core energy from ship." John's stomach dropped. The ship, the one that had crashed in the forest, the one likely swarming with those gray-skinned hunters now. Going back there was suicide. But without that device working, they were sitting ducks. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. But then something shifted in Zira's eyes. Determination. She wasn't ready to give up, and neither was John. "Then we go back," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We get what we need from the ship, and we get out of here." Zira stared at him, as if searching his face for any hint of doubt. When she found none, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The plan was insane, but it was their only shot. They waited until nightfall. The cover of darkness was their best chance to slip past the patrols. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. Shadows deepened, and the air grew colder, carrying with it the distant sounds of alien machines humming in the distance. The journey back to the crash site felt longer this time. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent John's heart racing. But Zira moved with purpose now, her fear tempered by the urgency of their mission. John followed closely, his shotgun gripped tightly in his hands, though he knew it was little more than a security blanket against the technology they were up against. When they finally reached the clearing, John's breath caught in his throat. The ship was still there, its twisted metallic form glowing faintly in the moonlight. But it wasn't alone. Several of the gray-skinned aliens moved around it, their strange tools emitting beams of light as they scavenged through the wreckage. They were looking for something, maybe for Zira. John crouched low, pulling Zira down beside him. "How do we get close?" he whispered. Zira's eyes narrowed, scanning the scene with sharp precision. After a tense moment, she pointed to a section of the ship's hull that was partially collapsed. It offered some cover, but getting there would mean crossing open ground. John's mind raced. They needed a distraction, something to draw the aliens away from the ship long enough for Zira to slip inside. He looked around, spotting a cluster of rocks nearby. It wasn't much, but maybe it would buy them a few precious seconds. He motioned to Zira, signaling for her to wait. Then, creeping as quietly as he could, he moved to the edge of the clearing. His heart pounded in his ears as he picked up a rock, aimed carefully, and hurled it into the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. The rock struck with a sharp crack, and immediately the aliens froze. Their heads snapped towards the noise, their black eyes gleaming in the darkness. For a moment, John thought the plan had failed. But then, two of the aliens broke off from the group, moving towards the source of the sound. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Zira moved like a shadow, slipping through the darkness towards the ship. John held his breath, watching as she disappeared into the wreckage. The remaining aliens continued their search, oblivious to her presence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. John's muscles ached from tension, his eyes never leaving the ship. Then, just as he was beginning to fear something had gone wrong, Zira reappeared, clutching the glowing crystal in her hand. But they weren't alone. One of the aliens spotted the movement, letting out a sharp, piercing screech that echoed through the forest. The others turned instantly, their black eyes locking onto Zira. "Run," John shouted, springing from his hiding place. Zira didn't hesitate. She sprinted towards him, her feet barely touching the ground. John raised his shotgun and fired, the sound deafening in the quiet night. The blast hit one of the aliens square in the chest, but instead of falling, the creature merely staggered, its gray skin smoking, but unbroken. Bullets won't stop them, John realized, panic rising in his chest. But they didn't need to fight. They just needed to escape. Zira reached him, and together they plunged back into the forest, the sounds of alien pursuit hot on their heels. The glowing crystal pulsed in Zira's hand, casting strange shadows on the trees as they ran. They didn't stop until they were sure they had lost their pursuers. When they finally collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath, John turned to Zira. "Tell me the thing works," he panted, nodding towards the crystal. Zira gave a weak smile, her glowing eyes bright with hope for the first time. "It will," she whispered. "But we must hurry. They will not stop." John nodded, his resolve hardening. They had a chance now. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The forest had never felt more suffocating, even as John and Zira managed to put some distance between themselves and the alien hunters. The oppressive feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow trailing their every step. The stolen crystal pulsed faintly in Zira's hand, casting a dim, bluish glow on their path, but even that small comfort was overshadowed by the weight of what lay ahead. They couldn't just run forever. That much was clear to John now. Hiding would only delay the inevitable. The aliens wouldn't stop until they had Zira. And by now, they surely knew she wasn't alone. John wasn't just an accidental witness anymore. He was part of this fight. But running wasn't his style. If these creatures wanted Zira, they'd have to go through him first. As they reached a small clearing, John signaled for them to stop. The tension in his shoulders was unbearable, and he needed a moment to think. Zira leaned against a tree, her breathing steady but shallow, the faint glow of her skin dimming with exhaustion. The cloaking device, though now powered, wasn't enough. It would mask them for a time, but it wouldn't protect them from a direct confrontation. And it certainly wouldn't save the townsfolk who had no idea the danger lurking in their backyard. That's when John made his decision. "We can't keep running, Zira," he said, his voice low but firm. "They're not just after you anymore. If we don't stop them, they'll hurt everyone in Maple Ridge. My town, my people." Zira's glowing eyes met his, filled with both admiration and fear. She shook her head slowly, struggling to find the right words. "Too dangerous," she whispered. "You will die." John gave a humorless chuckle. "Maybe. But if we don't fight back, we're dead anyway. And so is everyone else." He paused, gripping his shotgun tighter. "We need to hit them first. Hard. Before they can make their next move." Zira was silent for a moment, her alien features softening as she studied him. Finally, she nodded, though the worry never left her eyes. She stepped closer, holding out the glowing crystal. "We use this, but need more power. From my ship." John frowned. "I thought we got what we needed." Zira shook her head. "Crystal, energy source. But for weapon, need ship's core. Dangerous, but it can stop them." John's mind raced. Going back to the crash site once was bad enough. But now, with the aliens on high alert and their numbers growing, it was a suicide mission. But then he thought about the people of Maple Ridge, the neighbors he'd shared beers with, the kids who played in the streets, the old man at the general store who always overcharged him for supplies. They had no idea the nightmare creeping toward them. If John and Zira didn't act now, there'd be nothing left to save. "We do it," John said, his voice steely with determination. "But we're going to need a plan." By the time they reached the edge of Maple Ridge, dawn was beginning to break, casting a soft golden hue over the quiet streets. The town was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the alien threat looming over them. John led Zira to an old barn on the outskirts of town, a place he knew no one would think to look. Inside, dust floated through the beams of morning light, and the faint smell of hay lingered in the air. They sat together in the dim light, sketching out a plan on the dusty floorboards. Zira explained more about her people, how they had once been explorers, seeking knowledge across galaxies. But greed and power had corrupted them. Now, they were conquerors, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. Zira had tried to stop them, but her defiance had marked her as a traitor. She wasn't just running for her life. She was running from an entire empire. John listened intently, his respect for Zira growing with every word. She wasn't just some alien who crash-landed on Earth. She was a fighter, just like him. And together, they had a chance, however slim, to turn the tide. Their plan was simple, but risky. They would use the cloaking device to sneak back into the crash site under the cover of night. Once there, Zira would extract the ship's core, while John provided cover. With the core, they could power Zira's weapon, a device capable of creating an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to disable the alien technology. It wouldn't kill them, but it would level the playing field long enough for John and Zira to finish the job. Night fell quickly, and with it, the sense of urgency grew. As they made their way back to the crash site, the forest seemed to close in around them. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. But John's resolve never wavered. He had made a promise, to Zira, to his town, to himself. He wasn't going to back down now. When they reached the clearing, the sight that greeted them was worse than they had imagined. The aliens had reinforced their numbers, and now strange, spire-like structures jutted out from the ground around the ship, pulsing with an eerie blue light. It looked like they were setting up a permanent base, a foothold for something much bigger than just a manhunt for Zira. John clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about saving Maple Ridge anymore. If they didn't stop the aliens here, Earth would be the next planet in their conquest. Using the cloaking device, they moved silently through the clearing, slipping past patrols and strange alien machines. The device masked their heat signatures and dampened their sounds, but they still had to be careful. One wrong move, and it would all be over. When they reached the ship, Zira quickly went to work, her fingers moving deftly over the alien controls. John kept watch, his heart pounding in his chest. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. Then, just as Zira extracted the glowing core, a sharp, piercing alarm blared through the clearing. The cloaking device flickered and died, leaving them exposed. The aliens reacted instantly, their black eyes gleaming in the moonlight as they closed in. John fired his shotgun, the blasts echoing through the forest, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. The creatures kept coming, their movements swift and relentless. Zira activated the weapon, the core pulsing with a blinding light. The electromagnetic pulse rippled through the clearing, and the alien machines sputtered and died. The creatures themselves staggered, their movements jerky and disoriented. "Now," Zira shouted, her voice fierce and determined. John didn't need to be told twice. He charged forward, using the chaos to his advantage. With each shot, each swing of his makeshift weapons, he fought not just for his life, but for everyone back in Maple Ridge. Zira fought beside him, her alien abilities turning her into a blur of light and motion. When the last alien fell, the clearing was silent once more. John and Zira stood amidst the wreckage, their breaths heavy but victorious. They had done it, but as they looked at each other, they both knew this was only the beginning. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Zira stepped closer, her glowing eyes softening. "You are strong, John. Stronger than many I have known." John chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, well, humanity's got a bit of fight left in it." As they made their way back to Maple Ridge, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees, John realized something profound. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope. And with Zira by his side, he knew they had a fighting chance at a new beginning. The forest was eerily quiet as John and Zira made their way back towards Maple Ridge. The adrenaline from their escape had worn off, leaving only exhaustion and the heavy realization of what they had accomplished, and what was still to come. The alien ship lay in ruins behind them, its core now powering the strange device Zira carried carefully in her arms. But John knew it wasn't over. Not yet. As the trees thinned and the town's outskirts came into view, John's stomach tightened. Maple Ridge looked the same as it always had, peaceful, untouched by the chaos they had just faced. But John knew better. Beneath that calm exterior, the town was on the brink of a nightmare it couldn't even imagine. Zira's eyes flicked to the horizon, her expression darkening. "They will come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They never stop." John clenched his jaw. He had heard those words before, but now they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The aliens wouldn't give up just because their ship was destroyed. If anything, that would only make them more determined. They would come back, and when they did, they wouldn't just be hunting Zira. They would be coming for all of them. As they reached the old barn on the edge of town, John pulled Zira inside and slammed the door shut behind them. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, and the air felt thick with tension. "We need to warn the town," John said, pacing the length of the barn. "They need to know what's coming." Zira shook her head, her glowing eyes filled with a sadness that made John's chest ache. "They will not believe," she said softly. "And even if they do, they cannot fight." John stopped in his tracks, her words sinking in. She was right. What could the people of Maple Ridge do against an alien force with technology far beyond anything on Earth? Guns and courage wouldn't be enough this time. But giving up wasn't an option. "Then we fight for them," John said, his voice steady. "We find a way." Zira stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She placed the device on a workbench, the faint glow from the alien core casting strange shadows on the walls. "There is a way," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "but it is dangerous." John snorted. "Dangerous? That's been the theme of the week." Zira allowed herself a small, sad smile before explaining. The device she carried wasn't just a power source. It was a weapon, one capable of releasing an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to disable any alien technology within a large radius. But there was a catch. The pulse wouldn't just disable their tech. It would draw every alien ship in the vicinity to their location. It was a beacon and a bomb all in one. "We use this," Zira said, her fingers tracing the glowing lines on the device, "and they will come. All of them." John swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a stone. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. But they had something the aliens didn't: human spirit. It sounded cliché, but John believed it. Humanity had a stubbornness, a refusal to back down even when the odds were impossible. And that was exactly what they needed. The plan was simple, but it was risky. They would lure the aliens into the forest, far enough from the town to keep the people safe. Once there, they'd activate the pulse, disabling the alien ships and weapons. Then, it would be a fight to the finish. As night fell, they prepared for the final showdown. John gathered what supplies he could from his cabin. Ammunition, flares, anything that could give them an edge. Zira worked tirelessly on the device, her hands moving with a precision that spoke of years of experience. The bond between them had grown stronger, forged in the fires of survival. They weren't just allies now. They were friends, maybe even more. When everything was ready, they made their way to the heart of the forest, the place where it had all begun. The air was thick with anticipation, every rustle of leaves sounding like the approach of an unseen enemy. As they reached the clearing, Zira placed the device in the center, its glow casting an otherworldly light on the surrounding trees. She turned to John, her expression serious. "When I activate this," she said, "there is no going back." John nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I wasn't planning on it." Zira pressed her hand to the device, and it hummed to life, the light growing brighter until it was almost blinding. The sound that followed was like nothing John had ever heard, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. And then the sky lit up. Ships, sleek and menacing, descended from the heavens, their dark forms blotting out the stars. The aliens poured from the trees, their black eyes gleaming with malice. But this time, John wasn't afraid. As the pulse wave rippled out from the device, the alien ships faltered, their lights flickering before going dark. The creatures themselves staggered, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. John raised his shotgun, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "Let's finish this." The battle that followed was unlike anything John had ever experienced. The aliens, though disoriented, were still deadly. But John and Zira fought with a desperation that gave them an edge. Every shot fired, every blow struck was fueled by the knowledge that they were fighting for more than just their own survival. They were fighting for humanity. At one point, John found himself face to face with one of the alien leaders, its gray skin shimmering under the moonlight. The creature raised a weapon, but before it could fire, Zira appeared from the shadows, her eyes glowing bright as she unleashed a blast of energy that sent the alien sprawling. Together, they fought until the last alien fell, the forest once again falling silent. As dawn broke over the horizon, John and Zira stood amidst the wreckage, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. They had done the impossible. They had fought back, and won. Zira turned to John, her expression softening. "You are remarkable," she whispered. John chuckled, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Yeah, well, we're a stubborn species." Zira's eyes sparkled with something John couldn't quite place. Admiration, maybe even affection. Perhaps there is hope for this world. John looked out over the forest, the rising sun casting golden light on the trees. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe there is." And as they walked back towards Maple Ridge, side by side, John knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him and Zira, but for all of humanity. The first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, casting a soft, golden light over the scared landscape. The forest, once a place of quiet serenity, now bore the marks of battle. Burnt patches of earth, splintered trees, and the twisted remains of alien technology scattered like the bones of some great beast. The air still crackled faintly with the residue of the electromagnetic pulse Zira had unleashed, and the faint smell of ozone lingered like a reminder of the night's chaos. John stood at the edge of the clearing, his shotgun hanging loosely in his grip. Though the danger had passed, his body ached from the fight, every muscle sore, every scratch and bruise a testament to the hell they had endured. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a quiet, simmering pride. Against all odds, they had survived. They had won. Behind him, Zira moved through the wreckage, her glowing eyes scanning the remains of the alien ship. She was looking for something. John wasn't sure what, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the heaviness in her steps. This was more than just a battlefield to her. It was the final remnant of a life she could never return to. As the morning light grew stronger, painting the forest in hues of orange and pink, Zira finally stopped, her gaze falling on a small, intact piece of alien technology partially buried in the dirt. She knelt, brushing the dirt away with careful fingers, revealing a smooth, metallic surface etched with the same strange symbols that adorned her skin. John approached quietly, careful not to disturb her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough from the night strain. Zira didn't look up. "A beacon," she whispered. "For my people." John's heart skipped a beat. The last thing they needed was another alien arrival. But as he looked closer, he saw the sadness etched into Zira's face. This wasn't a weapon. It was a relic, something that connected her to a past now lost forever. "They won't stop, will they?" John asked quietly. Zira finally met his gaze, her luminous eyes filled with a sorrow deeper than words could capture. "No," she said softly, "but they will not return soon. Not after this defeat." She paused, her gaze drifting back to the beacon. "But others, they may come. Someday." John nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a thick blanket. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. It might never be over. But for now, they had time. Time to rebuild. Time to prepare. Time to hope. As they made their way back to Maple Ridge, the town was beginning to stir. The sun had fully risen, casting a warm light over the quiet streets. To anyone looking from the outside, it was just another morning in a sleepy town. But John knew better. The world had changed. He had changed. When they reached the outskirts of town, John paused, glancing at Zira. She stood at his side, her silver hair catching the morning light, her skin shimmering faintly as if reflecting the dawn itself. She looked out of place here, like a star that had fallen from the sky. Yet somehow, she fit. She belonged. "What now?" John asked, his voice softer now, the adrenaline finally ebbing from his system. Zira tilted her head, considering his question. For the first time since they met, there was no immediate danger, no life or death decision to make. It was a strange feeling, foreign and fragile. "I stay," she said finally, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. This world, your people, you fought for me. I will fight for you. John felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a mix of relief and something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. You're welcome here, Zara. For as long as you want. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and rebuilding. John and Zara worked together to clean up the remnants of the battle, carefully dismantling and hiding what alien technology remained. They couldn't risk the government, or worse, curious civilians, stumbling upon it and asking questions they weren't ready to answer. But beyond the cleanup, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Zara adapted quickly, learning the ways of Earth with an eager curiosity that brought a rare lightness to their days. She marveled at the simplest things: running water, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the taste of fresh food. And in return, she shared pieces of her world with John, stories of distant galaxies, of civilizations long gone, of beauty and wonder far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them deepened. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were partners, friends, and perhaps something more. There were moments, quiet, unspoken moments, when their eyes met, and the space between them felt charged with something electric. But neither of them rushed it. They had time now, and they both knew the importance of letting things unfold naturally. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, John and Zara sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky. "Do you ever miss it?" John asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You're home." Zara was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse above them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "I did," she admitted. "But now, this is home." John felt his heart swell at her words. He reached over, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. The warmth of her touch was grounding, a reminder that despite everything they had faced, they had found something rare, something worth holding on to. As the night deepened and the stars burned bright above them, John realized something profound. Humanity wasn't just about the people on this planet. It was about connection, about the bonds they formed, the love they shared, and the hope they carried into the unknown. And as long as they had that, they could face anything. The abandoned alien woman had found a new beginning on Earth, but so had John. Together, they were more than survivors. They were a testament to the resilience of life, the power of connection, and the unyielding spirit that defined them both. And as they sat side by side, staring into the infinite expanse of the universe, John knew one thing for certain: whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.